Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Professor Russell T. Warne, and we will be talking about intelligence. Hello, Russell. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Russell, intelligence is becoming a controversial topic. Some argue that IQ tests are not real, they do not measure intelligence, and success in life is not necessarily linked to IQ. Obviously, you disagree, but before we begin to talk about intelligence, some years ago you wrote a paper criticizing Stephen Jay Gould titled Stephen Jay Gould's Analysis of the Army Beta Test in the Mismeasure of Man, Distortions and the Misconceptions Regarding a Pioneering Mental Test. Tell us all about Stephen Jay Gould and his flaws.
Stephen Jay Gould was a paleontologist who was a very big name in the late 20th century. If you're as old as I am, you remember him from his guest starring appearance on The Simpsons in an episode where in an archaeological dig, Lisa uncovers what she thinks is a skeleton of an angel. But he was famous. For being a popularizer of evolution, but he was also very insistent that scientific findings fit his political and social views. He was an open, avowed leftist. And one of his most popular books was called The Mismeasure of Man, which was published in 1981 and re-released in 1996 in the updated version. And in that book, Gould says that the field of intelligence testing had its roots in phrenology and in the early classification of racial groups in early anthropology, and that the field had never shaken that racist past, and that it was still contaminated today, and that intelligence testing was pseudoscience. Um, Over the decades, people, including while Gould was alive, had criticized him and pointed out factual inaccuracies and errors in his book. Um, and so, yeah, in gosh, what year was it? 2000 and I want to say 18.
2018, you wrote the article in 2018.
Yeah, 2019, sorry, 2019. Yes, I published that article you said. And funny story, scientists really don't know in advance how their work is going to be perceived. I knew people knew about Mismeasure of Man, but by then, even the updated version was over 20 years old. Most of the text was unchanged from the 1981 version. And Gould had been dead several years. And I thought, man, I'm feeling like I'm jousting with a dead man. You know, I feel like I'm arguing with someone who can't argue back. He's, long gone, whatever. But my students wanted to co-author with me. Some of them had been in my testing class, my psychometrics class, and they were interested in the Army Beta, which was a World War I era test. And so I said, all right, look, we'll write about the Army Beta. I didn't think it was really going to go anywhere. I thought people don't really talk about the Army Beta anymore. This is a test that's 100 years old. Gould's dead. I'm jousting with a dead man. And boy, did that article get way more attention than I thought it was going to. So it's funny that you want to lead with it. But we found that in the 20 pages where he discusses the Army Beta, not everything, but most of what he said was either incorrect or was consistent with other interpretations. And ironically, if Gould had done better research, he could have found some information that supported his view even more. But his historical research was extremely shallow. He did a lot of reading his projecting his views onto the past, and he really did give these pioneering psychologists in the 1910s the short a short what's the phrase I'm looking for?
Time limits?
Yeah. He really did not recognize how amazing it was to create the Army Beta. It was the first test of intelligence that didn't require reading or understanding spoken language beyond just the instructions. Group testing was in its infancy, and these people created a test from scratch that was later given to almost 500,000 men without the aid of modern technology and computers and modern communication and statistical software. And for its time, it was very good, and it's not the best measure of IQ today, but it still can do the job if you're looking for a free 100-year-old test, because we gave it to a modern sample. So and actually I've been interviewed about the history of psychology by a couple other people, and so if you've ever heard any of those interviews, you'll know that I don't like it when people criticize historical figures for not thinking like 21st century people. And that's, Gould was very much criticizing people from the turn of the 20th century for not having the viewpoints that were popular 3 generations later. And I think that's not interesting.
That's nonsense.
Yeah, I agree.
But Russell, let me make a quick point. I
Okay.
don't know if you are familiar with Ernest Bax, but Ernest Bax in his book, The Fraud of Feminism, details a litany of studies noting that sex differences are real. And this book was written over 90 years ago.
No, I wasn't aware of that, but that doesn't surprise me. There are real sex differences in behavior and in physical capabilities. Some of them are so blindingly obvious. One of the strongest psychological sex differences is that men have a stronger preference for multiple sex partners than women do. Men are taller on average than adult women. I mean, yeah, there are differences out there. People who want to wish them away or think that acknowledging those somehow makes you sexist are not being fair to the evidence.
But Russell, how did your conclusions destroy the findings of Stephen Jay Gould? Give a specific example.
Well, The Mismeasure of Man's a book that's hundreds of pages long. We only analyzed the 20 pages where he talks about the Army Beta. And honestly, if Gould had never written that section about the Army Beta, the book would still really not have any different of an impact. It's not the most important section of the book. I think it's one of the most interesting because of my interest in the history of science. But he did things like he omitted important information, like he writes about how the examinees taking this test, many of them were immigrants. They couldn't understand English, but it says specifically in the instructions that to the proctors, these 100-year-old instructions, that that it was okay for them to give instructions in Italian and Russian, which were some of the most common languages of immigrants at the time. He just with zero historical evidence whatsoever. His phrase is that because of the instructions, most of the men must have ended up either confused or scared shitless. And there's zero evidence for that. And then he claims that the time limits were too low, but there was actually a lot of care put into deciding these time limits. I mean, most of what he said, he either made up, as far as I can tell, or he just drew conclusions based on very scanty evidence, and his historical research was extremely limited. Um, and I can find very little evidence that, besides the test and its instructions, that I can find very little evidence that he actually consulted any period documents.
Russell, you are interested in science, so more than likely you could be familiar with the research of Jason Lewis, who argued that Stephen Jay Gould is data and research on skulls is incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've encountered that, the controversy over Morton's data, 19th century data. Um, and now the museum that owns those skulls is repatronizing them to the countries that they came from, and so pretty soon no one's going to be able to re-examine those. But yeah, Gould's whole argument in Mismeasure of Man was that scientists are hopelessly biased. They either consciously or unconsciously look for evidence to support their viewpoints. They figuratively put their thumb on the scale to show what they want. And in a sense, he's right. I mean, if you think the universe is made out of cheese, you're going to invent a cosmic cheese whiz detector. We do create instruments and studies to look for evidence that matches our theories. But he thought that in particular, intelligence testing and related fields in the social sciences were just so hopelessly sexist and racist that they need to be thrown out completely. And that's not true. And I wrote a companion piece for Quillette about this study about the Army Beta, saying that no, the way we remove our biases is to conduct our research transparently, share our data, make our interpretations open to others who can reinterpret them if they don't share our same biases. And that's not what Gould did. Gould just declared other people have their biases. And he said, so I'm going to expose theirs. Of course, he has his biases too. And ironically, his book ends up being the best example of a biased scientist looking for what he wants. Now, I don't know whether Morton's data on skull size for different racial groups is valid or not. I really don't care. It really doesn't have anything to do with 21st century science. Um, but we could, generations later, over a century later, reanalyze Morton's skull data because he recorded it openly and because the skulls up until about now are still there. And so that just goes to show that the way to battle human biases in science is to make the data available, to be open, to be transparent, and that will hopefully reduce ideological squabbles in the future. Although I don't think we'll ever get rid of them fully.
Russell, most of us have been exposed to a popular study done years ago, noting that the IQ scores between soldiers from the North and the South are similar, and in some cases, Northern soldiers performed better on IQ tests. And this argument has been invoked to refute the salience of IQ tests. But I have a question, Russell. Would it be more sensible to compare Northern soldiers to Southerners who were actually educated?
Yeah, I believe you're talking about the World War I data.
Yes.
And that was a big controversy from about the 1910s to the 1940s when there was better data that came out in World War II. And yeah, people look at it and say, wow, look at data from the northern US. These people score higher on the test than people from the southern US. And that was true within racial groups, between racial groups, etc. Um, and everyone knew that, you know, in the early 20th century, the northern United States was more industrialized and more educated than the southern United States. This wasn't a shock to anyone. Everyone knew this. And so I don't think those differences invalidate the tests at all. In fact, if anything, it shows that if you think environment and education matter and can make someone smarter, then you should see those differences develop. You should see those differences on a test. If you didn't, something might be wrong with the test. Where the only people I think who would be concerned about that are people who don't think that experience or environment can impact someone's mental abilities. And I don't think there's anyone like that in the 21st century. Early 20th century, yes. But in this day and age, I've never found someone who didn't think that more schooling and a healthier, more stimulating environment couldn't raise IQ. And so I'm not really concerned about that World War I data at all. Although I agree with you, if you must make comparisons historically, and there's good reasons to do that, I prefer making comparisons with the Army beta data, because that one consists of men who either did not speak English or who had a very low education level, about fourth grade or lower, give or take. And I feel like those differences are in education are much smaller than what we saw with the test designed for men who could read English, which was the Army Alpha. You know, some of those people had a college education, some of them had a fourth grade education. And so if you must make comparisons, I prefer comparing people with low education with low education.
That makes perfect sense, Russell. And there is also another foolish objection to measuring IQ.
Mm-hmm.
Measuring intelligence is difficult. That is not an argument. Starting a business is hard. But should we prevent ourselves from starting businesses because it is challenge because doing so is challenging?
I hope not. Look at all the things humans have accomplished that have been challenging. You know,
N-
going to the moon was a challenge, especially with 1960s technology.
Nothing that is easy is worth doing.
Exactly.
And
You could make
why
it.
is it difficult to measure intelligence?
Well, that's one of the things I address in my book, In the Know: Debunking 35 Myths of Human Intelligence. There are people who do believe that it's hard to measure intelligence. But I show in chapter 7 actually that it's probably one of the easiest human traits to measure. In fact, it's so easy to measure that some people have tried to create tests that measure other traits and have accidentally created an intelligence test instead. And so now I'm not saying that any old fool can just write a couple of questions and have a good test. You know, if you want a test that's good enough for commercial or scientific purposes, you do need to get a large representative sample to norm the test on. You do need to do a lot of item tryout. But any task that is cognitive in some sense will measure intelligence at least partially. People have been looking for over 100 years, and no one's ever been able to find a task that requires cognition of some sort that didn't measure intelligence. And so, you know, even things that we think of as being very, very simple, basic tasks like reaction time are partial measures of intelligence. Now, I wouldn't build a test of IQ just around solely
No.
reaction time, but it's it's a trait that is used in so many human interactions and in so much of human cognition that any cognitive task will measure it. The challenge is pulling out the measure of intelligence when you want to measure something related like creativity or spatial navigation or things like
No, Russell?
that. Mhm.
No, the interview is going to get really funny, and
Okay.
our listeners will be laughing at the idiocy of individuals who criticize intelligence without sufficient reason. So, for example, it is often argued that IQ tests are culturally biased, but
Mhm.
I am familiar with such exams and they are measuring general ability. If as a black person I migrate to Europe and decide to get a PhD in European history, then my PhD is more biased than an IQ test.
True, true.
No, no,
I, I mean, I see why people say these tests are biased. I mean, the reality is they were and still are mostly created by people from Western cultures.
so was the telephone.
Yeah, so is the telephone, but people don't use telephones to evaluate someone with it on a trait as important as intelligence. And so I get why people say that. It's important to say what's not on these tests. A good example is we do not put written stimuli on tests for people who do not read that language fluently. And for most tests, except for the instructions, which someone who's bilingual can usually understand, um, we usually require someone to be a native speaker of a language if we're going to use written stimuli. And we don't do things like have pictures of items from industrialized countries like computers or cell phones or cars. We don't take those pictures to undeveloped parts of the world like the Amazon jungle and then show these pictures to people and say, what is this? And then act like the person's stupid when they don't know what a computer is when they've never seen one. Of course they don't know. That doesn't make them stupid. It just means they haven't seen one. Who cares? And so when some people think, oh, these tests are biased, that's what they're imagining. Oh, we're giving a test in English to someone who's a native Spanish speaker. And we're not doing that. Um, there there is a lot of care that has to go into cross-cultural testing. And I have been a critic of people unthinkingly using Western tests in developing nations, especially in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where I don't think those tests are functioning correctly. And I'm actually working on an article about that.
No, Russell,
Mm-hmm.
because you mentioned developing country, I like the flow of the conversation. So I'm
Okay.
going to ask you to talk about an article you wrote titled Spearman's G Found in 31 Non-Western Nations.
Yep.
Strong evidence that G is a universal phenomenon.
Yeah. So, and talking about cross-cultural issues and testing is the perfect segue to that. So I'm glad you brought that up. Um, so I mean, there are good situations where we cannot use a Western test in other language groups, other cultural groups, other nations. And so some people look at that and say, well, this must mean that intelligence tests are biased. This must mean the tests are garbage for these groups. General intelligence doesn't exist for them. And general intelligence is too culturally bound. I wrote that article. It describes a study of where my student and I found almost 100 data sets from developing nations. Most of them were in sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Asia, but a couple of them were in Central America, couple in other parts of the world, Oceania, for example. And we found this cognitive data and we used a statistical procedure called factor analysis, which tells you how many groups of variables you had. And for the vast majority of data sets from all over the world, we found just one factor, which tells us that regardless of where a person was and what tasks they were doing, that the same ability to help them excel on one task would help them excel on others. And that's exactly why we think there's a general intelligence in Western populations. And this general ability in these developing nations looks a whole lot like the general ability in the West. And so my conclusion with my co-author was that this shows that general intelligence or general ability is really strongly cross-cultural. There probably is a general ability to solve problems throughout humans all over the world. What's different is the cultural manifestations, the ways that cultures allow that ability or train that ability to show up. So, yeah, I posted a video on Twitter just before the pandemic started. And for my child who was in kindergarten at the time, he was actually explicitly being taught to classify objects into abstract groups, which is something we ask people to do all the time on intelligence tests. And so giving him that task is really great to measure intelligence in the West because we value that, and that's taught in schools. But in another country, intelligence may develop from being able to understand information about a local religious tradition, or may be able to be about retrieving facts about the local wildlife and how to know when a person's in danger, etc. That doesn't mean that the ability is different. The ability seems to be the same worldwide. There's still a general mental ability. What's different is the cultural manifestations, and tests need to measure and give people tasks that make sense in their culture for those tests to be valid for a group.
Yes, Russell, but historical research has shown that Westerners who assimilate into the cultures of pre-modern societies do well. In order for them to survive, they would have exerted higher levels of intelligence. Intelligent people will prosper in foreign environments.
That is true. I'm not aware of the specific research.
The article was written by Nathan Nunn. It's online. I think it's titled History and Culture, and he also has another piece titled History as Evolution. Mm-hmm. And he delves into some of these issues. But Russell, are you telling me that if we decided to create a culturally determined test for a developing country, then intelligent people in that country will still do better than the less intelligent? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we just have to make sure that the tasks on the test make sense to that culture and aren't foreign to the point where we're measuring familiarity with the task instead of intelligence. And there are some tasks that are really strongly cross-cultural, especially for children. It's a lot easier to write cross-cultural test questions and tasks for children. The more cultures you want an item to measure or a task to measure, the harder it is to write, though. And if you want something that truly is universal, you're being forced to ask about questions about how, for example, the sun is out in the day but not in the night, water flows downhill, things like that. Things that are basic universals that everyone's familiar with. And there's not a lot of those, and it's hard to make really advanced items that are truly universal. But if you only want tasks that work across 2 or 3 or 4 cultures, that's a lot easier to do than to try to write a test that works for everyone.
But Russell, you are not vitiating the case for for IQ tests. Based on what you're saying, IQ tests will always be problematic.
I don't think that they'll always be problematic,
In the
but
sense that they are measuring general ability.
they are measuring general ability,
And
but
some people will not do well. So in that case, to liberals and their supporters, IQ tests will always be problematic.
yeah, not everyone does well on these tests because humans are different. That's part of the wonderful human diversity. Not everybody's tall. I'm short. That doesn't make me less of a person.
No.
Some people have depression, some don't. There's individual differences in that. I just see intelligence as being one more variable, one more characteristic that people differ on. You're right that it does have some baggage to it, and it does have important consequences because smarter people do prosper in their societies on average more than less intelligent people. But there's other variables like that too, and if you find that troubling because of your political or social views, that's all the more reason to understand this, because otherwise you're just putting your head in the sand and you're in denial. And if you don't have a full understanding of human nature, then be prepared for your social plans and policies to disappoint you.
And we can learn from the less intelligent.
Definitely.
Their views may reveal the intricacies of a particular culture, thus aiding sociological and anthropological research.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So I like to have conversations with intelligent people, but diversity is the spice of life.
Oh, definitely.
Intelligent, less intelligent people can provide us with humor. They serve a purpose.
Well, and not just that, but if you boil down human worth to IQ, then you're a pretty reprehensible person. um, I know people who I am positive will always be struggling with life because I don't know their IQ score, but some of them have noticeable limitations, and they greatly enrich their families, and they serve their communities, and they make valuable contributions to the people around them. And so I don't worry about the IQ of my neighbors or a family members or someone, um, because they can still enrich my life and make my life better and make my community better, and they can still live very fulfilling lives regardless of what a test may say.
Exactly, and many highly intelligent individuals are unkind.
Definitely. Definitely. And we need more charity towards others who are different. And at the end of my book, In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence, I do make a plea for more compassion, because if you're going to read a nonfiction science book, you're probably above average in intelligence. I make a plea for my readers to have more compassion towards other people in society who were not dealt the kind genetic and environmental hand that made them smart, that made my readers smart. And so I do hope that the message of compassion comes out.
But Russell, I've had conversations with individuals who are not very educated, and maybe if they were to do a test, their score would be low. But I recognize that such people are quite realistic. Individuals who believe in the utility of IQ based on my experience are usually not very bright. I find that ordinary people tend to be more realistic than the highly intelligent.
One problem you get in very bright people sometimes is is people falling in love with abstractness in lieu of concrete daily life. Um, and that can be a problem. There's something to be said for living a very practical life and having a lot of practical skills. There's a family in our neighborhood that that my wife and I are friends with, and the husband's a plumber and a handyman, and I'm definitely not, and I very much value and respect his skills. I have no idea what his IQ is. I could care less. Um, but yeah, if you're the sort of person with their head in the clouds like I am, and you love ideas and abstract concepts, that doesn't help you very much when the toilet breaks.
Not at all. And because people like your neighbor are working in the real world, they value IQ. Because
Mm-hmm.
if they employ someone who is not up to scratch, they can lose money or people may die.
Definitely, there is practical consequences of intelligence. Definitely.
Yes, but I find that the highly intelligent, their their ideas are literally in the clouds.
Yeah, very often.
And without a doubt, ordinary people will love your book.
Oh, I hope so. I'm glad that you say that.
Yes, they will. But Russell, can we boost IQ? So, for example, one writer has a book. I believe the title is IQ and How to Get It.
Richard Nisbet.
Richard
Yes,
Nisbet,
I know
yes.
that book.
So, can we really boost IQ? And if so, by how much?
Um, yes, we can boost IQ, but and the conversation, the real interesting part is in that but. Um, um, we do not know how to boost IQ permanently for someone who already lives in a middle or upper class environment in a oh, sorry, just dropped something. Sorry. We do not know how to boost IQ for someone who already lives in a middle or upper class environment in a wealthy country. Um, and so, my children are the children of a college professor. We live a comfortable middle class life in the United States. um, I do not know how to permanently raise my children's IQ. They already have a really good home environment. um, my oldest just finished first grade. He has a very good school. There's books in the house. I mean, if I knew what more to do, I would do it for my own kids. And we don't know how, for people who already live in that environment, we don't know how to permanently raise IQ. For
Reasonable
people,
point.
what was that?
I said reasonable point.
Yeah. So then what do we know about people about other environments? Well, put them in an environment that looks a lot like a middle or upper class home in a wealthy country. And we do that sometimes. It's called adoption. And it's hard to get really good adoption data because often the biological parents won't participate in these studies or they can't be tracked down. But the best data I've seen seems to indicate that if a child would grow up in a poor home within a wealthy country, adoption probably boosts their IQ by about 4 points, which is quite a bit. Um, and and although the international data is even shakier, um, there's got to be a boost if a child's adopted out of a Kenyan or a Chinese or an Iranian orphanage into a middle or upper class home in the UK or in Sweden or in Canada or the US.
Yeah,
Exactly how much we don't know, but if you want to raise someone's IQ permanently, put them in that environment where we don't know how to get any further gains. The problem is we don't know what it is about those homes in those wealthy countries that raises IQ. You know, we don't know whether it's the schools or the intellectual activities that parents do. We don't know if it's the nutrition. We don't.
Yes, because I read a book once and the writer noted that malnourished children in an Asian country, or malnourished children of Asian descent actually scored quite high on a test.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. There is a relationship between poverty, nutrition, and IQ, but we're not sure as to the various nodes yet.
Exactly. And so anyone who says, here's a multivitamin to give to your child to make them smarter, or here, send your child to preschool, it'll make them smarter. If that child's already in a good environment in a wealthy country, there's no reason to believe that their IQ will go up. But you know, I read a study once in the Philippines where treating children for parasites, and some of these children lived in villages where there was a high rate, you know, 70-80% of children were infected with multiple parasites. Treating that raised their school performance. And so I'm more, you know, if you want to make people smarter, yeah, let's improve the health, let's improve the environment of people in developing nations, let's improve the environment for the poor in wealthy countries. But we don't, for people who already live in wealthy countries, we don't know what it is specifically. We just know that it's some vague, make the environment look like a middle-class home.
Okay, and
But we
read
don't
to
know what.
children. Russell, you should read to children and play music. These are
Yeah,
very important factors that can positively impact IQ.
I mean, maybe, but we don't have any strong evidence, especially if a child already lives in a home where that sort of thing's common. But we do know that severe neglect can lower
Yes,
IQ.
yes.
We know that um, malnutrition, especially long-term iodine deficiency, um, and folic acid prenatally, can lower IQ. And so the advice is we'll make sure the person's not exposed to a bad environment, but beyond preventing damage, you know, how can we optimize everyone, help them live to their full genetic potential? That's what we really don't know beyond a vague, well, make your home good enough that you could adopt a kid in a wealthy country.
But because we're discussing adoption, we do know that the intelligence of adopted children are closer to their biological parents.
Yes, there is a boost that comes to IQ from adoption, but you're right. The correlation between adopted children's IQs and their parents' IQs are stronger for their biological
Yes.
parents than their adoptive parents after about age 10 or so, give or take, depending on the study and the country and other things. At younger ages, the correlation's stronger with their adoptive parents. But by the time kids get to their teenage years, definitely the correlation's stronger with the biological parents' IQs. Although, again, there's still that boost that does come from adoption. Adoption does seem to benefit these children
Yeah.
intellectually.
And Russell, I like to research diversity. So I'm interested in personality differences based on race. However, the consequences of the black-white IQ gap are more important than the existence of the gap. I think that's quite boring. Should
Yeah.
we care about the black-white IQ gap?
I think we should,
Okay.
if for no other reason than the fact that it is an empirical, replicable finding that goes back over 100 years in psychology. Um, and you know, psychology for the past decade has been reeling from a crisis of classic findings not replicating.
Yes.
Here's a replication, you know, here's a finding that's been replicated hundreds of times for over a century. So if for no other reason, the fact that we know that this is a real finding and a lot of other stuff in psychology is not, yes, we should care.
Yes, the mainstream consensus is that the black-white IQ gap is persistent, but the causes of the gap are unknown. But you have done research based on your surveys and personal reading. Is it genetic or cultural?
Um, I think that there's not just one cause to any racial difference in IQ, whether that's black, white, or East Asian, European, or Hispanic white, or whatever. Whether these are international differences, I don't think there's just one cause. Very few things in the social sciences have a single cause.
It's multifaceted.
Yes, definitely environment matters. Um, and to me, the strongest evidence for that is the fact that when people immigrate from developing
To the
nations
US, they get rich.
to wealthy nations, their children, the children of these immigrants who grow up in the new host country, have higher IQs than their parents. That must be environmental. They got their genes from their parents. The parents have these genes too. There is no possible genetic cause for that. It has to be environmental. So that tells us that internationally, some of the IQ gaps we see must be at least partially environmental in cause. And I do think that some of that environmental influence undoubtedly also applies within nations, within the US, within Australia, within the UK, etc.
Yes, so changing the environment can boost IQ. More than likely,
Definitely.
you read Discover magazine. Discover magazine often advocates the view that brain training programs can raise IQ.
Mm-hmm.
Is there evidence for this assertion?
Well, brain training programs, um, they have been studied a lot in about the past 15 years. They became very popular as iPads and smartphones were developed, and the baby boomers wanted to slow down their cognitive aging. Um, those brain training programs and games are very good for training the tasks that they teach, but there does not seem to be any transfer to general abilities. There's no transfer to other abilities that aren't taught. And um, so, if you learn, for example, one of these brain training programs has a memory task. Um, it might help you with your short-term memory to memorize a string of digits or letters, but that won't transfer to building your vocabulary or other more distant tasks. It will help you memorize strings of things. And that's not nothing, but it won't raise your general intelligence. And for about the past 5 years, we've had several literature reviews, large scale studies, meta-analyses, almost all of which have put the nail on the coffin of the idea that brain training programs raise general abilities. But it is definitely true that they do raise the abilities that they focus on.
All right, quite fascinating research. Now, Russell, it is often said that very high intelligence is not more beneficial than moderately high intelligence. Is this statement true?
No, and we actually have a name for that in the field. It's called the threshold hypothesis. The idea that there's a certain threshold that above that level,
Yes, I've read several articles making this point.
yeah, above a certain IQ, having more and more and more IQ points or being more and more and more intelligent doesn't help you. That's the hypothesis. And again, not a lot of good evidence about it. Although I do say in the book that this is sometimes very very challenging. to research, because the higher you set the threshold, the harder it is to find a large sample of people that smart. Um, and then the threshold hypothesis takes different forms. You have a lot of people who think it only applies to personal life, things like finding a partner, finding a fulfilling relationship, relating to others. Other people say no, it also applies to work and education. I have never been able to find really good, strong evidence for the the threshold hypothesis. And actually, the best research um, seems to indicate that the benefits of being smarter just keep going up as you get smarter and smarter and smarter. There don't seem to be any major downsides with being in that top 1% or 0.1% or 0.01% of the population.
All right. So Russell, do you know your IQ?
I don't, and because I study these tests for a living, if I were to ever take one, because I know how they're designed and everything, my score would be grossly, grossly inflated. I've been asked before in interviews, what is your IQ? I mean, I have a guesstimate, but uh, to me, it doesn't matter a whole lot. I mean, I have a happy family life and I do okay in my job, and so whatever my IQ is, it seems to be serving me well.
Yeah, like I am interested in IQ research. I don't place a premium on my own IQ, but Russell, I'm going to ask you to do something impossible. Okay,
Okay.
you're a researcher. You don't know me well. I am maybe you have not been reading my articles, but estimate my IQ just for the fun of it.
I mean, I don't know you well enough to do that. Um, yeah, my rule of thumb, I tell this to my students, if you are interested in a technical scientific topic, if my students choose to enroll in my class, or if someone chooses to read my book, they've got to be above average in intelligence. People with an IQ of 90 or 85, they don't want to read a 350-page book about IQ. It's boring, it's too technical, and sometimes they'll feel dumb. And so, I mean, I don't know, but I assume that the fact that you're interested in a topic tells me that you got to be above average. How much so? I don't know. I don't know you well enough to
Yes,
to guesstimate.
and not quite important at the moment. But Russell, we're discussing IQ and its relationship to success in the workplace. There is an article published by Inc., a mainstream publication, and it is titled "Why Your IQ May Have More Influence on Your Success Than You Think." And the evidence is actually overwhelming. One study one study shows that cognitive ability is more important than emotional intelligence. Let me read a snippet. Cognitive ability was more than 5 times more powerful than emotional intelligence. The average employee with high cognitive ability generated annual revenue of over 195,000 compared with 159,000 for those with moderate cognitive ability and 109,000 for those with low cognitive ability. Emotional intelligence added nothing after measuring cognitive ability. Your response?
That's very much in line with the research, and I have chapters in the know that address emotional intelligence and the importance of IQ at work. And I'm on the fence about whether emotional intelligence is a real ability. That's addressed in chapter 26 of the book. I think that the concept was popularized in the mid 90s in a big New York Times bestseller book. But the
Daniel
concept,
Goleman? Was it Daniel Goleman?
yes, Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence. He popularized it before the concept was really ready for practical usage. It was still in its very early theoretical stages. And the research is improving, and I'm still not convinced it's a fully real ability, although I'm intrigued by it. But what I am convinced of is that, exactly what you said, its importance compared to general intelligence is trivial. There's probably some isolated jobs here or there where emotional intelligence would be very, very important. An example I give to my students is a wedding planner. You want a wedding planner who can monitor other people's emotions, can smooth over conflicts, and has great interpersonal skills. You want that. But for most jobs, you would rather have a smart, rude, emotionally unintelligent employee than a very emotionally intelligent employee who has a below average IQ. That's true for the vast majority of jobs.
All right. So, Russell, I am not an expert in your profession, but as someone who reads, so for example, in any given day, I am willing to read 5 quantitative studies. So, as someone who is not an expert, I am going to tell you the truth. Russell, emotional intelligence is a function of IQ. When we say that people are expressing emotional intelligence, it indicates that they're really manipulating others to get what they want.
and, and I've seen that viewpoint before. I've heard it before. Um, and for the aspect of emotional intelligence, of being able to navigate others' feelings, I can see how there's a little bit of a manipulation component behind it. um and so, I'm not willing to go quite there. I'm still intrigued by the idea of emotional intelligence also being self-monitoring one's own emotions, recognizing them, being able to label them, understand when they're justified or not. I'm intrigued by that piece, but for the piece that is more about navigating others, yeah, I can see how that would be interpreted as a general manipulation ability.
Yes, and I have several examples. I could be with a colleague. The colleague wants a product or a better service from a company. And then when he's successful, in our conversation, he replies, I just use my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just common sense. Less intelligent people are more impulsive and they may find it difficult to temper a situation when it becomes too hostile.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No, and you're right, and there definitely is a cognitive component to emotional intelligence, and I would be very surprised if that were separate from general intelligence. And that's again why I think, man, when Goleman wrote that emotional intelligence book, and I think it was 1995, if I remember right, um, the concept wasn't ready for prime time, and now here we are decades later still playing catch up. The proponents of emotional intelligence are trying to show what ideas really are supported, and the skeptics are producing more and more research showing that there's not a lot that's unique about emotional intelligence, and some of them are finding a lot of overlap with cognitive abilities, like you say. um, so, I mean, nothing I can do about it. Can't go back in time in the 90s and stop Daniel Goleman from publishing his book.
but Russell, if intelligence is so important, and we both admit that intelligence is a crucial variable to explain success, Louis Terman, he studied brilliant young people during adulthood they achieved, but we don't know their names. And you actually produced a paper on the topic. Tell us a little about it. Why did Louis Terman didn't why didn't he identify the Nobel Prize winning economists and scientists?
So Lewis Terman was in his day, he was one of the most famous psychologists in the United States, and he was president of APA. Um, Today, he's most well known for his study of 1,528 high IQ children. All of them had an IQ of 135 or higher. And they were followed long for decades, 74 years actually, 78 years. I'm trying to remember exactly. Yeah, 78 years. So long after Terman died, they were still being followed for decades after. And he did find that yes, these children had more education. In fact, they graduated at higher rates from college than even Americans do today. Um, they had more education. The men earned more money. The women who had careers, because this was the start of the 1920s when most women did not have permanent careers, but the women who had careers also had more prestigious careers than average, earned more money than average, etc. Um, these people were more likely to become professors, to publish literary or scientific work. And some of them did accomplish great things. You said that some of these, you said that we don't know their names. We don't know most of them, but some of these people within their lifetimes did step forward and say, I was in the study. Um, One of them, probably the most famous one, his name's not very well known now, is Ansel Keys, who was a biologist, nutritionist, and he helped develop the Army's rations in World War II. That's why they're called K rations, because they were named after him. His last name Keys. A photographer for Life magazine, Shelley Smith Midens, came forward and said she was one of Terman's subjects. Academy Award nominated director Edward Dimtrick was also one. At least two future presidents of the American Psychological Association, and even Lewis Terman's own son, his own kids were in the study, who later became president of Stanford University and was one of the people who started Silicon Valley. So I mean, they did reach really impressive
Yes.
accomplishments, many of them, not all, but many. But you're right. He missed two Nobelists. He missed Luis Alvarez and William Shockley, who both earned Nobel Prizes in physics. And I published an article last year saying that there's a couple reasons for this. The most simplest being that unusual events are hard to predict. Um, that's just the statistical nature, that outlier events are hard to predict. And earning a Nobel Prize is an outlier event. It's extremely rare. It doesn't happen a lot. And that's one of the reasons. It's the same reason why psychologists are terrible at predicting which specific person will commit suicide in the next year. That it's an outlier event. It's hard to predict. Or it's why the FBI doesn't use statistical models to try to predict where terrorist activities are going to happen, because they're outlier events. Instead, they spy on people, they use informants, etc. They don't throw data into a statistical model and try to predict when the next bombing is going to happen. That's not how they do it.
Yes. And before we go, please speak briefly on this topic, genes and intelligence. Throughout our conversation, we implied that IQ is genetic, but just be a little more specific.
Yeah, we definitely have overwhelming evidence that there are genes that are related to higher intelligence. We've known this for decades with research, like I said, about adoptive children having IQs more strongly correlated with their biological parents than with their adoptive parents. But in the past about 5 to 10 years, behavioral geneticists have actually uncovered some of the DNA variations that are more common in high IQ people than in low IQ people. And it's gotten to the point where we can now, with a DNA swab, predict a newborn baby's IQ. Those predictions aren't very good and accurate right now, but the proof of concept is there. The predictions are only going to get more accurate. And, we have this overwhelming evidence that some of the reason why some people are smarter than others is because of their genes.
All right. Thanks for explaining the issue to us, Russell. Russell, I enjoyed our conversation, and at some point we may talk again, but I have to go. So bye.
I love it. Bye.
All right.